Welcome back to part 4, our final segment on language. This lesson discusses historical linguistics. So we have talked about the origins of language in the human species. Historical linguistics is the study of the development of language over time. So language and language use patterns change over time. They evolve, kind of like our genetics. Try reading an old letter written by your grandparents or perhaps a letter written by your own children. You'll see that language changes over the generations as well. Given enough time, these changes can result in distinct languages. Many of you may have learned a Romance language such as Italian, French, or Spanish. These languages are grouped together because of their similarities, and their similarities are the result of them all being derived from the same parent language, which is Latin. So historical linguistics study how languages change, how they eventually become new languages, and when possible, why they change. So this brings us back to power. You can think of the emergence of a new language in the same way we discussed a standard language versus a dialect. The emergence of a new language represents the successful cultural influence of the speakers of that language. In the United States, children are taught to think of language as part of a national identity. For example, we are taught to think that in France, people speak French, in Spain, people speak Spanish, in England, people speak English, etc. But all of these are exaggerations. So the long history of human settlement in Europe has led to great linguistic diversity. Even in places like modern France, Spain, and England, people speak many different native local languages beyond French, Spanish, and English. For example, they may speak Catalan, Breton, Welsh, etc. So the history of the emergence of a new language and its dominance over other languages at a national level is explicitly a history of cultural power. So the culturally dominant or politically dominant winner gets to choose the language, and their language is usually spread and proliferated throughout the lands. So those cultures that were the most influential in the past through political or economic means have left their mark on the present with their language. So what are the effects of globalization on language? As people who speak different languages interact, an inevitable linguistic impact occurs. This can be seen in the untold number of loanwords from one language to the next. English has borrowed words from French, German, Spanish, and many, many more languages. The same is true in reverse. Thus, as globalization increases, interaction and communication between people around the world has an increasing impact on languages. So here's an example of generations, and perhaps we can imagine this grandmother or great-grandmother and her granddaughter. Perhaps the grandmother speaks their native language, but it has been lost over the generations. And that's what's happening across the world. We have diminishing language diversity. As globalization increases, we have seen diminishment in the diversity of languages spoken around the world due to the economic and political power wielded by the Western world, Western languages, and by that I mean languages from countries in Western Europe and the areas that they colonized. So the United States, Canada, Australia would have been influenced by Western Europe and part of the Western world as well. So in these areas, Western languages have begun to supplant other languages around the world. And today, just 10 languages are spoken by more than 50% of the world's population. That's 10 languages out of nearly 7,000 known languages in the world. Approximately 50% of all languages in the world, about 3,500, are spoken by just 0.2% of the world's population. So there are many indigenous languages at risk, and native speakers of those languages are lost with every generation. So this is just an example of how globalization affects language and the way languages are spoken and the linguistic diversity across the globe. And this concludes our lesson on language. Thank you for listening.